In episodes 1 through 3, we talked about building grief-resilient teams and supporting team members through loss. But what happens when you're the one who's grieving? When you're supposed to be the decision maker, the steady presence, the one with answers, and you're struggling to answer your email? I've experienced this a few times myself as a leader, when deep grief put me into a fog that made it hard for me to make decisions or focus on my work. There were also times in the midst of grief where I felt like I was really on the ball, firing on all cylinders, and yet in retrospect, I wasn't making very good decisions. The truth was that because grief can affect our brains for so long, we're not always that good at assessing our current state and capabilities. Today, we're going to explore what research tells us about grief's impact on leadership cognitive function, how to maintain team effectiveness while you're personally struggling, and most importantly, how to prepare in advance so that when grief hits, you can be both human and effective. You're not choosing between being human and being a leader. You're choosing to be a leader who plans for your humanity. Because as we've already established, loss is going to happen, change is going to come upon us. But if we plan ahead and build systems that help us to take care of ourselves and take care of our team and our responsibilities, then we can grieve in a healthier way that helps us recover faster. Imagine that you're a product leader who suddenly experiences a major loss. Maybe it's a death in the family, maybe it's a divorce or a serious health diagnosis. The specific loss doesn't really matter. What matters is that your brain is now operating in grief mode, while your professional responsibilities haven't actually changed. The immediate reality is that your engineering team still needs work to do, still needs guidance, is still delivering. You've still got a release coming up. Customer support is escalating issues to you. You've got stakeholders filing new requests and asking for things. And maybe if you're like me, you start accepting things that you shouldn't and blowing up your roadmap. You're avoiding difficult conversations because the conflict just feels impossible to navigate. I think as leaders, we sometimes build up this mythology for ourselves and what we're supposed to be. And we tell ourselves that good leaders push through, that the team needs us to be strong, that showing struggle undermines our authority. This mythology creates a devastating choice to be human or to be effective. But what actually happens, according to neuroscience research, is that leaders who try to maintain a business as usual approach during personal crisis create worse outcomes for everyone. The teams become anxious, engagement drops, recovery ends up taking longer, both for the leader and the organization. The question isn't, how do I lead effectively while grieving? The question is, how do I build leadership systems that work even when I'm not at full capacity? This shift from personal strength to systematic resilience changes everything. As I've been digging into this topic of loss and change and grief and thinking about how it affects our brains, I've been reading a lot of research that I wasn't aware of before. In particular, related to our brains, there was a study of 93 older adults that found that higher grief symptoms directly correlated with worse performance on executive functioning, attention, processing, and speed measures. This isn't really about willpower. It's not something we can will ourselves through. It's just our brain chemistry. There's sort of like a grief brain versus CEO brain conflict. And when I say CEO brain, I'm talking about these executive functions of making decisions, paying good attention to things, being able to absorb new information. The prefrontal cortex, what researchers call the CEO of the brain, is precisely what grief compromises. This region handles strategic thinking, complex problem solving, emotional regulation, and risk assessment. It's exactly the things that leaders need to develop and maintain and have on point. And when we're grieving, all of that is compromised. And it's not a thing that we have physical control over. It's a chemical thing happening in our brain. Grief selectively damages emotional decision-making, such as risk assessment and weighing consequences, while leaving working memory and basic cognitive functions relatively intact, which means that you can still run a meeting, you often can respond to simple emails, you can handle routine tasks, and this creates a false sense that you're functioning normally, but you might be making poor strategic decisions, agreeing to unrealistic commitments, or avoiding difficult conversations that you really need to have without actually realizing that your judgment has been compromised. This selective impairment is particularly dangerous because it's invisible. You feel like you're operating normally when your most critical leadership functions are actually impaired. And the research finds that this attention and processing speed deficit that correlates with grief, the most severe symptoms of that really only appear in the first 6 months post-loss, and then you begin to recover. That gives us a concrete timeline for when leaders are cognitively vulnerable. What's really interesting is that while the leader might take 6 months to recover, there are ways to help your team recover more quickly. For a leader who just tries to be business as usual and push through and, act as if nothing's happened, the team is experiencing some uncertainty, some confusion, and that leader's impairment, which they don't necessarily realize is happening, means that the team is going to be unsteady for, on average, about 6 weeks. So if you run 2-week sprints, it means you're having like 3 sprints that are destroyed, really decreasing your productivity and your throughput, and the team's just uncertain and everybody's confused. For leaders who don't try to pretend that everything's okay, and they are open, they share a little bit, they ask for support, and they follow some of the guidance that I provide, their team is going to recover in a couple of weeks. There's still going to be a bit of shakiness that happens after the immediate impact, after the leader shares what has happened, because humans rally around each other and we are all sort of impacted by grief, even second or third hand. But leaders who take the right steps can help their team recover in a couple of weeks as opposed to 6 weeks. This is hard for leaders, though, because they tend to be more isolated, and product leaders in particular face unique challenges. They straddle strategic vision and execution and often lack peer networks for sharing grief experiences, and they carry responsibility for roadmap commitments that don't pause for human reality. So I have some recommendations that can help you. And in particular, these are things that you should implement before you experience grief. Because chances are, if you're not experiencing it right now, in the next 3 or 4 years, you probably will, unfortunately. And so if you implement these systems now, take these steps now, you're going to be better prepared for when that loss or that change occurs. The first is value clarification work. And I've mentioned before that I subscribe to a systems of ethics of contractualism and deontology aligned with my Christian faith. What's interesting is that the system of ethics to which you subscribe matters less than that you have a system of values and ethics and that you're disciplined in adhering to them. If you do that, you're going to be a lot more successful. So, you can't check alignment against values that you haven't clearly defined. If you don't already have a defined system of ethics, I encourage you to do a bit of research and find some system that works for you. This isn't like fluffy theoretical stuff. Ethics help us make decisions. They provide us guidelines for that. And so if you find a system of ethics that aligns with your values, it's going to help you navigate grief a lot better. Product leaders need pre-established frameworks for ethical decision-making, team treatment, and stakeholder relationships, because all these things end up intertwined. The second is a delegation architecture. And I recommend using the risk-sensitive decision-making capacity model. Big mouthful, but it's actually pretty simple. So this separates decisions into 4 tiers. The first tier, what they call leaf level decisions. These are low stakes, routine operational choices, individual task assignments, non-critical process adjustments. When you are in grief, these should be fully delegated. Assign these decisions to somebody else, but retain post-decision review. So maybe you meet weekly or twice a week or something with the people making decisions, review them, make sure everything looks good. The second are called branch level decisions, tier 2. These have moderate stakes. So feature prioritization within existing roadmaps, team resource allocation, client communication strategies. This should be something where you're working with somebody else to make the decisions in collaboration with them. So instead of paired programming, it's paired decision making. Tier 3, trunk level decisions. These are high stakes. Major roadmap pivots, significant budget allocations, key hiring decisions. You as the leader should retain authority, but involve trusted advisors throughout this whole process. And then tier 4, root level decisions. These have critical stakes. So these are strategic partnerships, major client renewals, organizational restructuring. You as the leader have to retain decision authority on this, but you should have executive council involvement. Decisions that you would have made solo in the past should be made as a team. Part of what this framework does is it frees up our energy so that we can conserve it for the decisions that really rely on us. We delegate all the low-level stuff that, we would normally do, but does consume our energy, does cause decision fatigue, does make it harder when we're in the midst of grief, and we retain our energy for those really high stakes decisions. But even in those high stakes situations, we don't go it alone. We have to avoid being isolated because our brains aren't working reliably and we can't trust them to necessarily make the best decisions in the midst of grief. But it's hard for product leaders, right? Because we have all of this information in our heads and all of it intersects and is interwoven. So one of the things we can do in advance is try to ensure that critical product knowledge isn't concentrated in our heads alone. And this isn't just documentation. It's building and developing multiple people who can make product decisions aligned with established principles. And this isn't necessarily for them to step in full time to do your job all the time, but identifying one or two people who at least understand your values and ethics and how you make decisions and who you can bounce things off of so that they can kind of check you and say, yeah, it sounds like you're headed down the right path. Yeah, it sounds like you're thinking about this correctly. Or that doesn't sound like you. That doesn't sound like the right decision to make based on how you've done things before. For somebody to know that, to be able to say that, they have to know how you've done things before. So you can't lead in isolation all the time. You do have to have one or two people who can kind of coach you and kind of hold you accountable and help you walk through this period of grief. So the third thing I want to share, first was the values and ethics. Second was the delegation architecture. Third is a strategic communication framework, the 3A model. What the research shows is that teams with transparent grieving leaders show 25% higher engagement post-crisis, 40% better error reporting, and 30% reduction in anxiety and absenteeism. And we've talked elsewhere around how our grief can trigger other people's grief. And there can be a grief contagion in the team. That can happen from you as the leader too. So this 3A model is first to acknowledge, name what happened without oversharing details. Second, to advise, clearly communicate available resources and support systems. And third, to arrange, outline specific work adjustments and who's covering what. Your direct reports need face-to-face communication with a little bit of Q&A space. Your senior leadership needs concise written summaries followed by discussion, and any external partners need formal notifications with some one-on-one follow-up offers. What's been fascinating about what I've been reading is that, again, as leaders, we've got this myth that we have to be bulletproof, that we've got to be in control, that we've got to be stable, unflappable, have to have all the answers. But when you as a leader admit vulnerability due to grief and you admit weakness, but you follow it up with decision-making, with being decisive, and you say, for instance, I'm going through this loss. Here are the things I'm going to delegate. Here's who I'm delegating them to. Here's the method. Here's the communication. Here's what happens next. You actually increase people's trust in you and their perception of just how good you are at your job. This really wows people. And these are all things that you can prepare in advance so that when grief comes, I always think about it as the stages of grief. My first stage of grief is always denial. And I know I've got a period of time when I'm going to be in denial that I got to get some stuff done. And so when I've got all this prepared, like when I'm in denial, I'm still not making good decisions. My brain is still impaired neurologically. But if I've prepared in advance, I can send this stuff out. I've already got the RACI models. I've already got the templates and the emails. I've already got some of the decisions made. And so I can send that out. And it makes a world of difference with your stakeholders, with your leadership, with your team. The fourth thing is for ongoing, and that's a decision-making capacity assessment. We've already talked about the risk-sensitive decision-making capacity, or RSDMC. So you kind of categorize decisions and you try to assess them. You also need a self-monitoring framework. So before making major decisions, kind of try to rate your current clarity on project goals, your risk appetite, your values alignment, and try to score each of these on a 1 to 5 scale. So for instance, you would say, how well do I really understand this? Ask yourself some questions, think through it, try to rate yourself a 1 through 5. Think about your risk appetite compared to your normal state, and just force yourself to dwell in this. Give yourself half an hour. Force yourself to wait half an hour and think through these things. Think about your values alignment and how confident you are that your decision aligns with your values. Rate these 1 through 5. If you score a 3 or lower on any of them, delegate it. And when you do your scoring, maybe talk to somebody else too. Another recommendation is if you've got a key decision that needs to be made, if it's not critical, wait at least 24 hours. Things that in the past you would have done really quickly, sleep on it, give them a day. Because when we have grief brain, our brain is taking longer to process things. It's always got a certain amount of its capacity going to grief, and that prefrontal cortex is not working as efficiently as it normally would. So just give it more time. So most of your decisions should probably wait until the next day. This brings us to something of a 2-week to 6-month strategy. So I mentioned earlier, leaders who do things right, their teams are going to recover in 2 weeks and they're going to start being, sort of normally productive again. You as the leader won't necessarily be, but if you've built the support systems that you need, then you can continue for 6 months and it's fine. Kind of not as good as you would normally be. That's the nature of grief, but teams can return to full performance in 2 weeks with proper leadership communication, even while the leader needs 6 or more months for cognitive recovery. So your week 1 to 2 implementation is to use your pre-established communication frameworks, activate your delegation structures, deploy transparent communication to get the team performing quickly. They'll be a little shook, but after 2 weeks, things will steady out and they'll be fine. And then months 1 to 6, the team is operating at full capacity with clear boundaries. The leader can then focus their energy only on the highest stakes decisions. This reduced pressure allows natural neurobiological recovery. It's something of a reciprocal support system. Your advanced preparation helps the team be successful during your crisis, and that team's quick recovery, them being up and running in 2 weeks, creates space for your longer healing process. There's an element of succession planning in all of this. And if you haven't gone through this before, I highly recommend it. One of the things I've always done in my jobs is think about a successor. So when I was at Missouri State University, I was there for quite a long time and I was grooming the person who would take my role when I was promoted. Was helping them learn everything they needed to know, making sure that they were ready when I moved up for them to step in my seat, because that would help me be more successful and I wanted them to be successful in that position. When I leave a job, I want to make sure that there's somebody who's ready to take over and step in. I want to make sure that the team is going to be taken care of. And so I think through who in the company my successor might be, and I make sure they get the training and support they need to be ready to be promoted. And when it comes to succession planning for grief, you're not needing to get somebody ready to replace you permanently, but you should have people who are kind of warm and kind of know what's going on for if you have to step out suddenly. So emergency replacements need some operational depth and crisis decision-making capabilities, but they don't necessarily need full leadership development potential. So this might be a senior person in your team, a manager, or somebody who can step in and do some things while you're gone, but they don't have to be ready to take over permanently. So for this week, I want to help you get prepared for all of this. The first thing I'd like you to do as part of your reflection and journaling exercise is a value foundation exercise. Take 15 minutes to write down your top 3 product leadership values. These are not aspirational values. This isn't like who you want to become when you grow up. These are the principles you actually use to make tough decisions. Examples might be psychological safety for my team comes before hitting arbitrary deadlines, or I communicate bad news quickly rather than hoping it resolves itself. One thing that I will share is I've got a series of articles I'm writing at the same time as I'm recording these episodes. One of them goes into ethical frameworks. I'll absolutely share that so that you can find it easily. For each value, write a specific example of a recent decision where you honored that value under pressure. Then write an example of a decision that would violate that value. This will help you recognize the warning signs during cognitively challenging times. The second is to start doing your delegation mapping. So look at your current responsibilities and map them onto the 4-tier delegation framework. What decisions are you holding on to that could be leaf or branch level? And what root level decisions need backup plans if you're suddenly unavailable? Identify one person on your team or on another team who could make branch level decisions in your style. What would they need to know about your values and decision-making approach? In terms of communication prep, go ahead and draft some template messages for different stakeholder groups using the 3A model, leaving blanks for specific details. And these also could just be generic enough that you may not even need blanks. Having these frameworks ready means that you won't have to think clearly about communication when you can't think clearly about anything. As a very common, simple example, uh, my wife and I have 3 children. And before all 3, I drafted communications, Slack messages, emails, things like that, that I was ready to send. So when we were ready to go to the hospital, I could get on my phone, hit send on a bunch of draft messages, and then clock out, and I was done. You can prepare similar communications for if you have to step out and have those ready, because when something terrible has happened and you need to grieve, I think it's really helpful to just be able to unload all this stuff. Like unload thinking about your team from your memory. You don't have to worry about them if you've already kind of prepared and sent out the communications and you've got all these frameworks in place. You're now free to grieve without having to worry about other people or carry a sense of duty for them. And so preparing these communications are really helpful. So draft some template messages. Again, that 3A's model, most of these might only be 2 sentences. But kind of have something prepared to help you out with that. The hard question to reflect on is what would happen to your team and your product if you, as the leader, needed to work at 60% cognitive capacity for 6 months. And in my experience, this translates pretty well to throughput. So think about how many meetings you take in a week. Cut out 40% of them. Think about how many JIRA stories you write, how many wireframes you produce, how many prototypes you're building, how many customer calls you're running to get feedback, how many surveys you're developing, whatever it is you're doing, cut it down by 40%. And what if you have to do that for 6 months? What systems need to be in place? It can be hard to think through this. It can feel a little morbid, kind of planning for the worst, but that's responsible leadership. And it's something that your team, your organization, and you deserve, because when you do this, it gives you the freedom to recover, and you will recover more quickly. Your team will recover more quickly. And like I said earlier, it's going to be good for your career too, because leadership and board members and stakeholders, the research shows that they will all view you far more positively. You'll get far better scores, reviews, outcomes if you take these steps than if you don't. If you are realizing that your current leadership approach depends too heavily on personal cognitive capacity, you're not alone. Most product leaders are one personal crisis away from having their teams fall apart. Not because they're bad leaders, but because they haven't built grief-resilient systems. My course, Leading Through Loss and Change, is all about building these frameworks and systems so that you can support your team and support yourself and support your company through times of grief, loss, and change. The delegation architectures, value clarification exercises, and communication templates we covered today are all part of the comprehensive leadership operating system that we built together. And if you're currently in the middle of your own grief or crisis, the Fieldway Studio coaching platform lets you work through these frameworks at your own pace with support tailored to your specific situation. Sometimes you need space to process, and sometimes you need practical help making decisions. Both are available. Leading through your own grief isn't about being strong enough to push through. It's about being strategic enough to build systems that work even when you are not at full capacity. Because remember, you're not choosing between being human and being a leader. You're choosing to be a leader who plans for your humanity. Your team doesn't need you to be invulnerable. They need you to be thoughtful and prepared and honest about what you can and can't handle. When you build grief-resilient leadership systems, you're not just preparing for loss, you're building better leadership for anything that you will face. Next week, we're going to explore ongoing grief and life transitions, because grief isn't necessarily a one-time event that you recover from. It's often a process that affects you and your team in waves over months and years, particularly if it's a long-lasting health challenge. We'll talk about how to build sustained support systems that don't burn out your own capacity or others' capacity for empathy in our work. Talk soon.